Blood on the frontier. These mountains have stood for 10,000 years. They have witnessed empires rise, crumble, and be forgotten by the sands of time. But one chapter remains unfinished, one wound that history has yet to fully acknowledge. This is the story of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, a land of ancient honor, a people of unbreakable will, and a century from 1839 to 1947, during which the full military might of the British Empire was unleashed against them again and again, in punitive expedition after punitive expedition. Villages burned, crops destroyed, families shattered, and still they did not submit. This is blood on the frontier. Before the British ever set foot on this land, the Pashtun people were not a lawless rabble. They were a civilization, a deeply tribal and egalitarian society, governed not by kings or colonels, but by Pashtunwali, one of the world's oldest and most sophisticated codes of honor and self-governance. Its pillars were unshakable. Nung, honor, the foundation of all things. Mel Mastia, an absolute unconditional hospitality. Badal, the sacred obligation of justice and revenge. And the Jirga, a democratic tribal council that resolved disputes, settled grievances, and governed communities long before British parliaments existed. The Afridis, the Wazirs, the Mahsuds, the Mohmans, they had turned back the Mughals, the Persians, and the Sikhs. This was not a wasteland. This was a free people on their own land, living by their own law. It began not with justice, but with paranoia. Convinced, without evidence, that Russia threatened India through Afghanistan, the East India Company assembled an army of over 21,000 men and marched it through a Pashtun territory. Villages were burned. Men were executed on mere suspicion, and entire people were made to suffer for a threat that existed only in the imagination of imperial strategists. The Pashtuns answered. In the frozen mountain passes of January 1842, they delivered the British Empire the most devastating defeat in its Indian history. Out of nearly 16,500 soldiers and camp followers who left Kabul, precisely one man arrived alive. This was not savagery. This was a free people defending their homeland against an uninvited, violent occupier. Aggression had come first, and the mountains had answered. The Pashtuns answered from the bosom of freedom that they will never be controlled by the Firangi, the foreign British. Britain could not accept humiliation, and so they sent a man with a mandate not to make peace, but to punish. General George Pollock, commander of the so-called Army of Retribution, marched back through the Khyber Pass in 1842 with a singular purpose: to make the Pashtuns pay. His campaign was not strategic. It was vindictive. Villages were burned to the ground. Livestock was slaughtered. Ancient defensive towers, built over generations, were blown apart with artillery. And in Kabul, he ordered the total destruction of the Great Bazaar, a centuries-old commercial heart, ruining the livelihoods of thousands of ordinary civilians who had no hand in any act of war. This was the precedent Pollock set. Collective punishment. Innocent people made to bleed for the sins of empire. Back in England, they called him a hero. History must call him what he truly was, a vindictive small man. Two worlds collide. On one side, a world built on consent. The Jirga, where men sat together under open skies and resolved disputes through consensus and community. Justice rooted in Pashtunwali, in restitution, in customary law, in the dignity of every man. A society that was organic, egalitarian, and answerable to its own people. On the other side, the cold machinery of empire. The frontier crimes regulations, a legal framework designed not to protect the people but to subjugate them. A political agent could imprison any man without trial. Entire villages could be fined, blockaded, and destroyed for the actions of a single individual. Rights that existed for every other subject of the British Crown were explicitly denied to the people of this frontier. The message was unmistakable. You are not citizens. You are not equals. That you are a problem to be managed by force. The British never wanted to understand these sons of the soil. Natives against natives. The British knew they could never truly conquer this land on their own. They could not navigate the passes, could not speak the language, could not read the terrain that these people had lived on for centuries. So they devised something far more insidious than brute force. They turned the frontier against itself. In 1846, Lieutenant Harry Lumsden created the Corps of Guides, Pashtun soldiers, dressed in drab khaki, trained in the very tactics of their own people and deployed against their own kin. Afridis were sent against Mohmans. Yusufzais guided columns into Orakzai villages. Men were paid to kill their cousins, guided by a foreign power that was simultaneously burning those cousins' homes. It was a cynical masterpiece of imperial strategy. Divide the people, weaponize their poverty, and ensure that no unified resistance could ever rise and harm the British Empire. The Perpetual War Loop. The British called their expeditions punitive, but punishment implies an end, a resolution. What they created on this frontier was something far darker, an engine of endless war turning on itself generation after generation, with no exit and no peace. The cycle was brutally simple. A British column would enter tribal territory, burn villages, destroy grain stores, kill men, often the wrong men. The survivors would return to find their homes ash, their honor shattered, their families destitute. And under Pashtunwali, the response was not optional. Badal, the sacred obligation of revenge, was not a choice. It was a duty. The next raid was therefore not just likely, it was inevitable. The British didn't create peace with their expeditions. They created a pause before the next cycle began. That they had built a machine that could only produce one thing: more blood. The scars of the Durand line. In 1893, a British diplomat named Mortimer Durand sat down with a pen and drew a line. 2,640 kilometers of bureaucratic violence slashed straight through the living heart of Pashtun tribal territory, dividing families, severing ancient trade routes, and cutting pastoral communities off from the lands they had grazed for generations. No Pashtun was consulted, no tribe gave its consent. Farmers found their fields on one side of the line and their homes on the other. Brothers became foreigners to each other overnight. An entire people were partitioned, not by war, but by ink. The tribes never accepted it, they never recognized it, and they were right not to. A border drawn by a foreign empire to serve its own strategic interests at the cost of a people's very way of life carries no moral authority. It carries only the weight of injustice. 1897, the Great Uprising. The Durand Line had been the final insult. In the summer of 1897, the frontier exploded. In an unprecedented wave of coordinated resistance, tribe after tribe rose simultaneously. Afridis, Orakzais, Mohmans, Swatis, Wazirs. The very Afridi tribesmen the British had been paying to guard the Khyber Pass turned their rifles around, expelled the British garrison, and seized control of the pass entirely. The British response was staggering in its scale. 44,000 troops, the largest force ever assembled on the frontier, were hurled into the Tirah Plateau. But the Afridis would not be broken in open battle. So General Lockhart ordered what the British always ordered when they could not win: total economic annihilation. Every house burned, every orchard destroyed, every grain store reduced to ash. Tens of thousands of women and children were left to face the winter with nothing. This was not war. This was the deliberate starvation of a people who had dared to be free. The economy of terror, air control. 1920s. Ground expeditions were expensive. Soldiers died. Politicians complained. So the British Empire found a cheaper way to terrorize the frontier: from the sky. In the 1920s, the Royal Air Force introduced what they coldly called air control. Instead of marching columns into tribal territory, they simply bombed villages from above. Warning leaflets were sometimes dropped first, giving families a handful of hours to flee before their homes were reduced to rubble. British officials spoke openly of the efficiency. One noted with chilling bureaucratic calm that within 45 minutes, a full-sized village could be practically wiped out and a third of its inhabitants killed. The targets were not military installations. They were homes, livestock pens, grain stores, yet the entire civilian infrastructure of a people's survival. This was not warfare by any honorable definition. It was economic terrorism, delivered with the impersonal precision of an empire that had long since stopped pretending to have a conscience. Resistance Dossier, Jalat Khan and the Mahsuds. Of all the frontier warriors who defied the British Empire, the Mahsuds of Waziristan stand in a category of their own. Fearless, ferocious, and unyielding, they were the tribe that no punitive expedition could ever truly break. And, in the crucible of 1919 to 1920, they found in Jalat Khan a commander worthy of their legend. During the Third Afghan War, as the entire frontier shook with rebellion, Jalat Khan orchestrated a massive, brilliantly coordinated assault on the Wana garrison. Armed with captured British rifles and fighting with devastating accuracy, his Mahsud Lashkars, militias, overran the position, humiliating the most powerful army on earth on its own claimed territory. It took the British 3 full infantry divisions, 60,000 men, and 14 grinding months to halt his advance. And the cost of that single campaign exceeded every previous frontier expedition combined. Jalat Khan had no empire behind him, no artillery, no air support, only his people, their mountains, and an unbreakable will to remain free. Resistance Dossier, the Faqir of Ipi. In the mountains of Waziristan, there lived a man the British Empire could never find, never buy, and never break. Mirza Ali Khan, known to history as the Faqir of Ipi, was a Muslim scholar, an ascetic, and the most elusive resistance fighter the frontier ever produced. From 1936 until the very last day of British rule in 1947, he kept the entire Imperial military apparatus tied down in the mountains of North Waziristan. The British threw everything at him. Royal Air Force bombers made raid after raid over his territory. Astronomical bounties were placed on his head. Paid infiltrators were sent to penetrate his inner circle, and failed every single time. He lived with severe austerity, moved like a shadow, and commanded the loyalty of multiple tribes who saw in him not just a fighter, but a symbol. The British never caught him, not once. His very survival, year after year, through bombing and blockade and betrayal, was a permanent, humiliating affront to the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Non-violent defiance, the red shirts. The British had spent a century insisting that the Pashtuns were inherently violent, that they understood only force. Then came Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, or famously known as Bacha Khan, and the frontier Gandhi, and he shattered that lie completely. He built the Khudai Khidmatgars, the servants of God, a non-violent mass movement 100,000 strong, disciplined, fearless, and dressed in their iconic red shirts. The empire's response revealed its true nature. On the 23rd of April, 1930, at the Qissa Khwani Bazaar in Peshawar, British troops opened fire on an unarmed, peaceful crowd. Between 200 and 400 civilians were martyred by the British. When Indian soldiers of the Garhwali Rifles refused to fire on unarmed brethren, they were court-martialed. The crowd did not run, but they stood and received the bullets in silence. Bacha Khan spent 15 years in British prisons, because a Pashtun man preaching non-violence, dignity, and unity was, to the empire, a far greater threat than any rifle. The final accounting, 1839 to 1947. When the British finally left in 1947, they left behind a ledger written not in ink, but in blood. Over 108 years, they launched more than 60 major military expeditions against the people of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. That is one military expedition after 21 months, with 100 of villages bombed, burned, and starved into apparent submission. Tens of thousands of civilian deaths, unrecorded, unmourned, and unacknowledged by the empire that caused them. The trauma was endless. The British have whitewashed these crimes, and after independence passed out the notorious FCR to further keep the Pashtuns underdeveloped. They called it civilization. But the Pashtuns had a civilization, ancient, dignified, and self-governing, before the first British soldier ever set foot in these mountains. What the empire brought was not order. It was state-sponsored chaos, inflicted on a functioning social order in the service of profit and pride. Every punitive column was a confession of failure. The Pashtun people were never conquered, only temporarily suppressed. Their resistance was not barbarism. It was the entirely reasonable, entirely honorable response of a free people to an unjust occupation. The scars remain, and history, true history, must remember.